What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. Of course, they did the live stream last night after the game in which I kind of recapped, hung out with you guys, had a lot of fun. Always love doing the live streams, but I kind of wanted to do a standalone video today talking about some of the news that came out, mainly the major injury news that came out after the game. Obviously, we were all very worried about Kayvon Thibodeaux, Darian Beavers. We'll talk about that. A couple of other things as well. I thought that there was an interesting note that came out from Brian Dable regarding the wide receiver core. And I'll also just briefly go over some of the things that I really liked coming out of last night's preseason game. And, of course, the regular season is going to be here before you know it. And I'm really looking forward to getting a lot more content on the channel with you guys and talking New York Giants throughout the season. Love all my supporters. So thank you guys for all the support you always show on the channel. But let's just briefly go over last night and some of the things that I look into and that I actually really liked out of the Week 2 performance. And, of course, we still have one more test, and then the Giants will have to finally get down to their final 53. And it'll be interesting to see which guys end up getting cut, but we're really thin now with some of the injuries that we've sustained at certain areas. So there will be some tough decisions for Joe Schoen, and we still definitely could monitor the waiver wire, potentially could trade a guy like Darius Slayton to get some depth somewhere else. So there's definitely a lot of things that could still go underway for the Giants before they get down to the final 53. But last night, let's start by saying this. The Giants were going up against backups once again, which is unfortunate. I want to see the Giants get an opportunity to go up against the first team. They haven't done that so far throughout the first 2 weeks. But you can only analyze what you can analyze. And we see how the New York Giants did against the opponents they were presented with. Let's start with Daniel Jones. And Daniel Jones, I thought, looked really good. He looked really confident in the offense. And so far through 2 games, again, against backups, the thing that has really stood out to me about Daniel Jones, he's been quick. He's been decisive. Hopefully that carries over into the regular season. But he was really good last night. He was 14 of 16. You could argue could have been 16 of 16. One pass was dropped by Daniel Bellinger, and it ended up being an interception. The other one was a 50-50 ball that could have came down. It could have went either way with a catch. He had 2 really good drives. Had Bellinger held on to the ball, we may have had 2 touchdown drives with Daniel Jones. So he looked good. He looked confident in the offense. He showed good pocket awareness at times. I thought he scanned the field pretty well, and he had a very good game. So that should at least give you a little bit of confidence going into Game 3 against the New York Jets before the regular season. But my main takeaway on the offensive end, outside of, certain wide receiver individuals, whether it be Colin Johnson, whether it be David Sills, whether it be Alex Bachman, who all had really good games. But my main takeaway in terms of an importance for this year's team in the regular season was the offensive line. That's something that we really have to monitor and something that's going to be very important if the New York Giants are going to surprise in 2022. Of course, we went out there and drafted Evan Neal, 7th overall this year, to pair opposite Andrew Thomas and hope that that could really shore up the offensive line. We still have a lot of holes in the interior. And again, we were going up against the second-team defense. But what I will say in this game, the pass protection was much better, specifically from Evan Neal. When you really got an opportunity after the game to go back and watch some of the film breakdown, some of the old 22, I think he had 2 pancake blocks. He was beat 1 or 2 times in pass protection, but overall it was a much better performance from Evan Neal, and at least should give you at least a little bit of sigh of relief. Do I think Evan Neal is going to come out there and be immaculate right away? No. I think he's going to have his struggles like most rookie tackles in the NFL, but he definitely showed strides of getting better yesterday, along with the majority of the offensive line on those first couple of drives. And what I really liked that the Giants did offensively in that game, they ran a hurry-up offense, so they definitely were showing you different looks as opposed to Week 1 where you didn't really see too much of that. There was at least a little bit more pre-snap motion. We saw they wanted to get Wan'Dale Robinson involved in the offense. That didn't really work out too well. But the line, for the most part, in pass protection looked a lot better. And that was without several of the other weapons out there. The offense could have looked a lot more explosive had they had a guy like, Kadarius Toney or Saquon Barkley. So really looking forward to seeing how this offense evolves Week 3 against the New York Jets in the preseason. We'll see how much time the starters get. But I thought the line was the big standout. Evan Neal is a specific individual in terms of importance for the regular season. Of course, I could talk about some of the 4th and 5th string guys, and Alex Bachman was absolutely terrific. But in terms of the importance for the regular season, I think that's really what I was looking at. On the defensive end, Aaron Robinson looked better. The secondary looked better. Kayvon Thibodeaux, I actually thought was getting pretty consistent pressure. And thankfully, and we're going to go over the injury notes, doesn't look like he's going to miss too much time for the New York Giants. But he looked like he was getting consistent pressure. It was good to see Azeez Ojulari back out there. He made a couple of good plays as well. So overall, a lot of good things. The one thing that I will say that needs to be talked about, that really needs to be improved upon, so far special teams has been bad. Whether it be punt coverage, whether it be kick coverage, it's definitely been a letdown so far. So that definitely needs to be improved upon going forward. So I didn't like seeing that 2 weeks in a row. Hopefully that's something that gets sorted out before the start of the regular season. But let's jump into some of the notes and quotes that came out today about some of the players and what it may mean for the New York Giants roster. And we're going to start with some of the injury news, some of the players that we were really concerned about after yesterday's game. The first guy we're going to talk about is former 6th-round draft pick Darian Beavers out of Cincinnati, the linebacker, who was really impressing a lot of fans at camp and in the opening preseason game. This coming out from Dan Duggan. Injury news, not as good on another rookie. The Giants announced that linebacker Darian Beavers tore his ACL, the second Giants draft pick to be lost for the season with a torn ACL. The other being offensive lineman Marcus McKeithen out of North Carolina, the guard prospect, who also will miss this season, and it's why we're incredibly thin on that offensive line. So obviously horrible news here. A fan favorite, a guy we were all rooting for. I didn't think Beavers was going to start, at least to open the year, but certainly was a guy that posed a threat to take over at some point, right, for Tay Crowder opposite Blake Martinez. And we were already really thin at that linebacker spot. You look at our linebacking core now without Darian Beavers. I mean, you're looking at McFadden, the other rookie that we drafted, and you're looking at Carter Coughlin outside of, Crowder and Martinez. And Martinez, of course, coming off an injury in his own right. So we're very thin now at that linebacker spot. Like I said, even with Beavers, we were thin to begin with. So now I have to think at some point the Giants are going to look to acquire an inside linebacker. For nothing else, at least depth purposes. That is something that I think they will have to look to address in free agency as the rosters start to get cut down. I don't expect them to go out there and make a monster deal for a guy like Roquan Smith. I know that there were rumors with the Chicago Bears. I very much doubt that will happen, but I definitely think they'll have to at least add some kind of talent at that position, even if he's not going to be a starter, to fulfill that void now that is left by Darian Beavers. But of course, a very unfortunate injury, and the way that Beavers was looking was really good. Injuries are part of the sport. It's just really unfortunate that it happens to a 6th-round rookie that was showing a lot of promise. Hopefully he gets back completely healthy next year and can make an impact for this New York Giants football team. But, horrible news for him and horrible news for the New York Giants based off of that. The more important player, and I'm not trying to discount Darian Beavers, but obviously Kayvon Thibodeaux, the 5th overall pick, the rookie that we're all super excited about this year, had tests after he had an injury scare last night. Initial tests revealed that Giants defensive end Kayvon Thibodeaux suffered a sprained MCL that is expected to sideline him for 3 to 4 weeks per source. His ACL and meniscus were intact. Giants are still hopeful that he will be ready for the regular season opener for the Tennessee Titans per source. So take that for what you will. If you do the math, 3 to 4 weeks, yeah, that could go as far into week 3 against the Dallas Cowboys. We're between 2 and 3 weeks before the start of the regular season. So if the New York Giants err on the side of caution, you may not see him till week 3. I would guess you probably see him week 2 at this point. But one thing I will say, the New York Giants should not force Kayvon Thibodeaux out there. You need to make sure that this guy is completely healthy for the start of the regular season. You don't want to force him. You don't want to do what we did to Saquon Barkley. I remember in his second year, I felt like the Giants rushed him back before he was probably ready to come back. You don't want to do that with Kayvon Thibodeaux. You want to make sure he's 100% set in stone. But how could that impact the 53-man roster? Well, I think that obviously upgrades the possibility of a guy like Roche making the team. But potentially a fan favorite if Thibodeaux is going to start on the injured list. Now, I don't know if that'll be the case. They may not do that. I don't know how many games he has to sit out if they do that. We'll have to wait and see. But regardless, not great news for the New York Giants in terms of week 1. I would expect that he will not play, but maybe he will. Maybe they're being cautious with the timeline, 3 to 4 weeks. Thibodeaux looked like he was fine, or at least relatively fine, after he came out of the blue tent yesterday. But things flare up the next day, right? I remember I've had several ankle injuries in my day. Not that I compare to the level of athlete to these guys. And it felt worse the next day. So that very well could have been the case with Thibodeaux. And, hopefully he gets better. But obviously great news there that it doesn't seem to be anything serious or season-ending or anything close to that. And we'll have Thibodeaux out there sooner than later. The other thing I'll add to this is the turf at MetLife. And we talk about this all the time in my channel and live streams, whether it be on Twitter, whether it be on my channel. It needs to be improved. And I think the New York Giants and the New York Jets, because obviously they're going to have to do this collaboratively, being that they play at the same stadium, should have looked into this going into this year. It's been widely talked about. I remember when Shanahan came with the San Francisco 49ers, and I don't know if you could attribute these injuries specifically to the turf. And I always say I don't think the turf is fully responsible for the amount of injuries that the New York Giants have suffered, and it's probably not even the main reason, but it's definitely part of the problem, and it's something that needs to be looked at. Opposing teams have been looking at it, and the Giants continue to suffer the most injuries in the NFL. For God's sakes, going into this game, the Giants had 18 players injured that couldn't suit up. I think there was like 7 offensive linemen that couldn't play in this game. They had to call back a player that they had cut the previous week in order to play this game because they were so thin on the offensive line. So that's something that the New York Giants have to look into. They have to address. And we could keep saying it as fans, but it's not going to change until such time John Mara does it. But to me, it seems as if it's at least part of the problem. And hopefully the New York Giants look into that. I don't know how much it would cost to resurface the field and put down natural grass and what the upkeep would cost. But when you're talking about paying multi-million dollars to these athletes, you want to make sure that they're as healthy as you possibly can. So hopefully that gets rectified at the end of the year. But I would say good news on the Kayvon Thibodeaux front. Expect him probably to be back week 2, at the latest week 3. And horrible news about Darian Beavers. I would expect the Giants to look and scour the market in terms of the linebacker position. The other thing that I wanted to briefly touch on was the wide receiver core, because I think this is a really interesting spot of this football team because there's a lot of competition in terms of who's going to make this team. This coming out from Madeline Burks. It was reported by several others as well. I think she was the first to report on it. She said, Brian Daboll, there's a quote from Daboll, the guys that have been out there producing, Colin Johnson, David Sills, they've been producing, and they're in the mix not just to make the team, but to play. So he's not only telling you that Colin Johnson and David Sills, if you're reading into that quote, have a chance to make the roster. He's saying, no, they're probably making the roster. They may get opportunities within the regular season to see valuable reps. So it sounds as if Daboll's been very impressed with those two guys. We have heard all along that Joe Schoen and Daboll have said the best guys are going to play. And so far, it's hard to argue that Colin Johnson hasn't been among one of the best guys. David Sills and Daniel Jones also seem to have great chemistry. He was looking for him early and often on that drive where he looked his best. As a matter of fact, the highlight play of the game was probably the back shoulder throw to David Sills where he went up and got it about 25 yards down the field. But if you go by that, and both of those guys stand a good chance to make this team, and I'm going to take Daboll at his word with about 10 days to go before we got to get down to the final roster, that would lead me to believe there's a high possibility that Darius Slayton will not be suiting up with the New York Giants. Obviously, he carries a $2.5 million dead cap hit. Maybe the Giants look to trade him for depth somewhere else on this roster, whether it be the interior offensive line, the tackle, the linebacker. We certainly need depth all over this roster. But if both of those guys make the team, I find it hard to believe that Darius Slayton will be suiting up with the New York Giants week 1. Maybe I'll be wrong, but you have to think they're going to at least give one of those spots to a special teamer, whether that be Board, whether that be Richie James, and obviously you have Golladay, you have Wan'Dale Robinson, you have Kadarius Toney, and potentially Sterling Shepard, depending on when he comes back from the injury. So it'll be really interesting to see how this all pans out. And that's not even including the star of last night's game, Alex Bachman. Bachman had a really nice play on special teams as well. I don't think Bachman will make the team, but if he's not claimed, which is probably a decent chance he will not be, I would expect the New York Giants to retain him on the practice squad and could certainly be a guy that if we have a couple of injuries, they could come in a pinch and probably operate from within the slot for the New York Giants. He looked really good last night as well. But right now, at least according to Daboll, it sounds as if both Colin Johnson and David Sills have a very good chance to make this team. So if you're a member of Sills Army, you probably got a big smile on your face with that quote. Can't wait to call the Jet game with you guys on the channel this week. I'll definitely be live with Bad Dog this week. Be on the lookout for that. But as always, if you like what you watch, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.